everybody for coming, even though we didn't have dinner tonight, but it's nice to see everybody. This is, I think, week 5, right? Week 4 of the class. Oh, that's right. And then next week will be the last week. So thank you for coming. I know it's a little chilly out and we didn't have dinner, so very nice of all of you to come out. Are there any questions about any logistical things before we get started? Or no, I'm glad everybody found an unlocked door and got in. So thanks very much. I know you did. Here you are. So thank you very much, and thank you.
Because there was no food tonight, I know you really want to know. I'm kidding. I was just saying, somebody asked about Sikhism, another religious tradition. Sikhism, of course, historically would come much, much later. Islam was already present in that part of the world, so it's from Punjab in India. But what I was saying was that in that religious tradition, there is communal meal at every service, every day. And by the way, in most of their temples, free food is offered throughout the day. So their kitchen is running all the time. People come and go. It's fascinating. Yeah, and I as I said, when I go there with my students, especially my students who are Christian, who attend church, they say there is something to learn here. Free food for everyone. And by the way, as I said, in Sikh temples, if you just come in for food, that's fine. You don't have to. So nobody is required to attend religious.
Have any around here?
Yes, yes. And that food is, by the way, for Sikhs, it is not like they have their religious service and then they also offer food. That free food is required because there is a requirement within that religious tradition to offer alms, basically. That is considered to be part of one's religious duty. So they say we cannot run a temple unless we also offer free food for everyone who shows up. And it is delicious. It's always vegetarian. It's kind of Indian style, vegetarian food. But everyone gets free food, and you can, just go in for food. And people do. It's very interesting. Yes?
They also wear that undergarment, like...
Yes, that's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah, it's called kach.
Yeah, it's like an underpants.
Yes. Yes, because traditionally in India, dhoti is worn, which is basically just a piece of cloth. Yeah. And then if you run or something, this is actually part of their kind of tradition that has to do, as I said, with their history, with being prepared to kind of defend their faith and so on, because several of their gurus were martyred, so they have very complex history in its own right. And yes, there are many Sikhs in Chicago, and there are several gurdwaras in Chicago.
The undergarment thing first, then, or the Mormons?
Oh, Sikhs, definitely. But yeah, I don't know if those things are connected. In Sikh tradition, this is something that one of their gurus commanded them, and it includes other items. It is interesting because most of them begin with a K. And so another item that they must wear, if you join that kind of, this is like, as I said, something comparable to confirmation, like later on in life, one must consciously declare that they want to belong to the religious tradition, to a kind of inner group of that tradition, and then they do all those things. So they have to wear an iron bracelet, which is completely closed, hard to put on. They have to always have a comb on them, men especially, for beard and hair. And then also, and this is if you remember, I'm sure some of you remember in our country there were cases where Sikhs were attacked, because of all kinds of misunderstandings and so on, and then also security reasons, because men are required to always have on them a dagger. So it's a ritual, kind of religious dagger. So nowadays most people would have something very small, but men are required to wear one. It's called kirpan, and so they always have it with them, and so it's very interesting. And hair must be put in a bun, and yes, men are not supposed to, actually men or women are not supposed to cut their hair, and men are not supposed to cut their beard, and they're supposed to put their hair in a bun and put the turban on, and that also is one of those kind of external signs easily visible. But yeah, that's Sikhism. Yes.
The ladies, do they also wear a
Yes.
bracelet?
Yes. And many of them would have last names Singh, even though it's not exclusive. But that last name means that they joined in a group of. There are people who are called Singh who are not Sikhs also, so it's not 100%, but most Sikhs have Singh in their name somewhere. Yeah, so this religious tradition is much newer, much more recent, kind of 16th century, 17th century on in Punjab. And it is originally something that was meant to bring Islam and Hinduism together, and both Muslims and Hindus began persecuting Sikhs. So it ended up its own religious tradition. So we can talk, if you have any questions. Tonight I did plan to finish on time. We'll see. You know that this is, in several religious traditions, there is that joke when, it goes different way in different traditions, but, it says something like, people plan and God laughs, right? So my plan is to finish on time, but we'll see how we go. So tonight we are moving on to China. And those religious traditions that I'll talk about will be Confucianism and Taoism, and they both have very, very deep history. They go as far back in time as we can tell, most of their elements, even though their beginning is, for both of those religious traditions, is associated with what some scholars have called the axial time. The axial time. So these are axial religions. And those would include religious traditions like, all those great prophets of Judaism, great prophets in the Bible, they come from that same time. In ancient Greece, great philosophers like Pythagoras, like Thales, they come from that same time. So over time, historians, and actually, I don't know if any of you follow history of philosophy, things like that. It was German philosopher Karl Jaspers. Karl Jaspers, he proposed that theory. He was asked at one point to write a popular book. He was 20th century German existentialist philosopher. He was asked to write a popular book on various religious traditions of the world, and he in his book proposed that he himself was astonished how theoretically, this didn't happen, theoretically, and by the way, with some of those figures, it is very hard to establish their historicity because archaeological evidence is scarce, but theoretically, people like Pythagoras in Greece, people like Zoroaster in Persia, people like Buddha, we talked about Buddhism last time, people like Confucius is a Western name, I'll say maybe a few words about that. And then also people like Lao Tzu, who is considered to be founder of Taoism, they all could have met. They all lived around the same time. First Isaiah, prophet Isaiah, for example, they all could have had a coffee together. How amazing. It is hard to make, this is not ideal. In recent years, there were some scholars who, there was one very, very influential American sociologist of religion who really went with that and made more contributions to that way of thinking. It's not clear. The idea, and what about that age, and this is very important for us tonight, what characterizes all those religious traditions? And we can trace that in the Bible as well, which is very interesting. Scholars do that. they all found morality to be central for their religious traditions. And you might find that surprising, because for many people, still today, they think that, morality is somewhere at the core of most religious traditions. That wasn't always so. So if you go back to all those religious traditions, before about 6th century, 5th, 6th, that period goes through many centuries. Some people even define it between 8th century BCE, so 2,800 years ago, to maybe 2nd century BCE. That's the axial age. So some people really stretch it over many centuries. But basically, let's say 5th century BCE. If you go back in time before that, for most religious traditions, morality was not central. This is obvious in some religious traditions. For example, in ancient Greece, priests, temples had nothing to do with how am I supposed to live my life. That question was not something a priest in a Greek temple would answer. This is why, for example, early Christians who had those questions on their mind would debate religious matters not with pagan priests, but with pagan philosophers who were concerned with it. Does that make sense? Axial age introduced morality, ethics into the core of what does it mean to live a good life. And both of those figures, and of course, Chinese civilization, just to remind you of this map, these are some places in China relevant for what we are going to talk about tonight. Chinese civilization goes as far back as anyone can tell. It's very, very old. Arguably, I did mention, for example, some forms of writing. We don't know for sure. It's so hard to say. And by the way, these are not value judgment. Who invented writing? Where was it? Where was it? And today still it seems as if the archaeological evidence points to Mesopotamia, to Sumeria. But the oldest writings that were found in China come from very similar age. Of course, and I actually have some examples of those inscriptions. And so people lived there for a very, very long time, and civilization was there for a very, very long time, and much of it is difficult to reconstruct. By the way, archaeology in China is constantly increasing. So our knowledge, understanding, scholars, Chinese scholars especially in recent years, for a long, long time, in 19th century, early 20th century, it was only Western scholars who did that kind of research. And then, of course, because of political changes in China, and then for a long period, not much was done, and then sometimes in collaboration with Western scholars. But today, there are already several generations of Chinese scholars who are doing this research, and they report on it continually. So probably in the future, many things will also be revised, for some part of history, some part, for considerable part of 20th century, leadership in China was not concerned with its deep history as much as they are maybe today, and they're getting more and more into that. So government in China today is paying lots of research in archaeology, which over time will help us figure out things that we can only guess about today. But this is about very old history. Many other aspects of Chinese history are well known because they were written down. Well, here are some examples, and this is interesting. This is very important for our understanding of what religious ideas were out there in China before Confucius, before Lao Tzu. So this is an example of what is called oracle bone. Those were known, but not for what we think they are today, but for something else. So Western scholars also reported on those. Those were actually in 19th century, when Western scholars went to China, many of those items were used in traditional Chinese medicine. They were ground up and used in medicine. But people noticed that there are writings on them. And people who were making those preparations were not the ones who wrote them. And then with time, archaeologists figure out where those coming from. And those are actually archaeological finds from places where they were used for a particular purpose. And then more people looked for them, more they found. And then they found hundreds, thousands, and then hundreds of thousands. It's really a lot. All of them have inscriptions on them. And the way Chinese script works is, of course, today, quite different than what it was back then. But
It's still going on.
right, so the principle that was used in those bones is very similar. So amazingly, the inscription on this tortoise shell. This is, by the way, tortoise shell, the lower kind of breastplate of a turtle. They can be read still today. So experts can actually understand what it says. Those were used for divination, for getting insight into what does, well, in simple terms, we know what, I mentioned that even with Buddhism, we know what we want. The world is another way. How can I get what I want? Well, it seems as if the idea was that one must align one's actions with the order of the world, the decree of the heaven. Basically, making sure that whatever you do is aligned with what the mandate of heaven dictates the world to do. And so you want to do something, you want to build a house, you want to, and some of those questions are, very small, some are very big, and some were asked by very important people. And through those oracle bones, we can reconstruct some history, because there were even questions asked by kings, and it was written down on the bone who is asking, what are they asking, and what the answer was. By the way, we don't know. Most of those bones were heated up. They were found close to fire pits. They were heated up and then cooled quickly, basically, probably put in water, and they crack. And when they crack, because question was written on it before, the way it cracks determines what the answer is. Does that make sense? You know, divination, it was big. Well, you asked about that white elephant that announced Buddha's birth, right? So divination, consulting soothsayers, consulting oracles, was very big part of religious traditions all around the world. We know, well, since I've been mentioning ancient Greece quite often, of course, in ancient Greece there were many, many sites, and later on even Roman emperors went to those same sites. Delphi and a few of those places are so well known, where special rituals were done, where that priestess would be in some kind of state of trance and then say things that were so opaque, so hard to interpret, then there were priests who had to go in and interpret. So here, we don't know for sure, but it seems as if there were religious specialists who knew how to interpret those cracks on the bones. And that gives us some insight. So what is religious about it? Well, the idea that there is unseen order of the universe, and we as human beings, we must align our actions with that order. So here are some more examples. This is, I guess, a shoulder bone from a cow. And you can see inscriptions, where's my laser, and also cracks here. Those can be found in thousands, and experts read them, as I said, and reconstruct both what were those people asking, what were their concerns, and what answers did they get for their queries. What's going on? You see, this is not, it doesn't really come up on this screen, but you can see in the middle there are inscriptions. So in this particular example, did I switch from previous one? There was one more. Yeah, I was showing this, but you can see inscriptions here. And then here you can see them better. This one is also from a turtle. And here actually down there, I wish this, in this region here, it is asking, it says the name of a person who is asking. he's asking the oracle to tell him if he should beat up another guy. It says, should I harm him or not? And then, so sometimes it is very, very, and it is also very transactional. Gifts are given, questions are asked, answers are given, and then more gifts are given to make sure that those answers actually come true. But a wonderful thing for scholars is being able to read those questions and answers and being able to begin to understand what religious ideas did those people have. Yes?
Would there be more than one question on a shelf?
I don't know.
I think there is, because my parents had different questions.
On this one, there are two sides to it. One side says yes, one side says no. And it also the bone includes the name of a person who was doing divination. So the diviner, these were common practices. By the way, in China, they were done in many other ways, not just this way, through movement of birds, movement of other animals, mice, and so on. There are all kinds of ways. And also, even today, there are other ways of doing divination. Many of them would not preserve, so we wouldn't know, but we assume those ways of doing divination existed back then. Typical thing that people would do in temples in China today still, this is, I don't know, if it is, how much it is practiced in China today, but in places like in Taiwan or in places, including in places like in California, you can definitely go to a place where somebody can do that for you, figure out. So those questions are often asked about things where you cannot get that answer any other way.
It's mostly in the village.
That's right. In many village temples, they would have a person who can do that, several people who do that, and those people then, they enter trance state, special kind of different state, and then there are different implements, it is done with different implements, and in some cases, questions are asked, and then there is a system in which two people hold an object, and they basically chant, and then when the question is asked, they trace a sign on a table, for example, that is the answer. And then there's a priest on the side who explains what the answer was and so on. Those are quite common. But like I said, for us, what is important is that there was the idea that there is some unseen order of the universe. And our responsibility is, whenever we undertake an action, we must align our actions with that invisible order. Well, here is one of those archaeological, you see how many? There are thousands there. So busy time for people who read, oracle bone script, But it is fascinating. So over time, there will be more and more of those. There will be specifics that will be reconstructed. There are more examples of this. So what can we tell from what was read from all those bones until today? There are no big narratives. There are no foundational epics. There are no creation myths that were recounted in a narrative form. By the way, next time I'll talk about Shinto in Japan. And of course, in Shinto in Japan, there are such narratives. And those religious traditions are quite related historically, even though, communication did not go back and forth all the time, but in its inception, people moved to Japan from China. And so there are similarities. But we'll see in Shinto, there are stories of creation. Kojiki is the book of stories of how did Japan come into being, and they include those divine beings, basically sacred narrative of how did gods create Japan and people and everything in it. We don't have such stories from China. There are terms that are mentioned that you already know, I'm sure, and there are some on this slide, yang and yin, right? Yang being one principle of the world, and yin being another, and they are complementary. So yang would be male, yin would be female, day and night, hot and cold, and so on, wet and dry. So the idea that there are opposites and that everything, complementary opposites, and that everything we see is basically a product of interaction of those opposites. Those ideas are already there. And then the good of the world depends on the equilibrium of those forces. That's why, I don't know, did you notice, but that's why I had to think about it not to make a mistake. They're not like good and evil. They're not. So one of them is not good, one of them, they're both complementary, and what would be, I guess, considered evil is this balance between the two, when one takes over. So balance, good. Disbalance, not good. But those two forces that make up everything, that generate everything into being, bring into being everything, when they're in perfect balance, everything is fine. Both are necessary. So we had that in those stories. So the idea that the world is also made up of different, so that religious question, I mentioned it in my very first talk. What is all this? What is everything? So it does come in two forms, right? One would be this kind of material, and one would be pure, ethereal, spiritual, Hon and Po. And then there are also supernatural beings. And by the way, supernatural beings abound. I mentioned that about Hinduism too, didn't I, when I said that sages sometimes said there are 330 million gods. Well, in China, definitely, traditional way of looking at things, they were endless. And by the way, many of those supernatural beings are dangerous, many are good. If you have trouble with any of those that are dangerous, you need good ones on your side. In most cases, people cannot do that work. You need another supernatural being to help you. So you have, and many of them are kind of what we would call, I don't know, ghosts, for example, deceased people who, for some reason, something wasn't done right by their descendants, so ancestors of people who were not treated well, they become supernatural beings, and in some cases they can make demands. By the way, this is why some of those rituals in temples are important, because those priests can tell you what must be done to appease, what went wrong, which proper action wasn't done, and if you know that, you can fix it.
Yeah, but sometimes they don't give you the right answer.
By the way, yes, that's a good point. And if they don't, of course, they lose their power because so much of the religious traditions in China is transactional in that way. And that includes dealing with those spirits. If you don't bother them and you don't need anything from them, doesn't matter. But if you want to do something, you better propitiate them, you better placate them, give them what they need. And if there are any disturbances, same thing. If there are no disturbances, everything is fine. But if there are, then you have to fix it by somehow, giving gifts to where they are due. Yes, and by the way, it is interesting, even very local gods, if, for example, things do not go well in a village, if crops is failing, if there is something wrong, people can actually send their local god away and ask another one to come in, because local god didn't do. In some cases, it is earth god, Tudigong, who can be sent away, and then another is put in its place to fix those things. Just like with our human affairs, you need different people to do different things. There are different supernatural beings who do different things. And in the case that I just mentioned, many of them are very much local. Right? I mentioned that about some other religious traditions. In China, this is a big part of how the idea of how the world works is that, in a way, kind of arrangement we see among people is a mirror image of the heaven. So just like in heaven, there's Jade Emperor in heaven who is in charge, and then there are lesser and lesser supernatural beings who are in charge of specific things, just like In our world, there's the emperor, and then there are other people who do other things. And of course, you don't go to the emperor with every request that you have, and especially something local. You know, if you want to do something in your village, you don't go to the highest of the high to ask them for permission. You ask your local gods for those things. So Shangdi I'm talking about pre-Confucian China. So things we can reconstruct about Chinese society before Confucius. So religious ideas, the dynasty that was in charge back then was considered to be descendants of the heaven, and whatever they did were works of the heaven. But then a change took place. Actually, one of their own generals took over and became emperor himself. And he insisted that the reason why he had to remove the previous emperor was because the previous emperor was not a good person. And the successor declared himself to carry the mandate of heaven that he didn't have by birth, just like in those stories I mentioned, you know, when kings in a way usurp power, they have to also relate themselves to those divinities. So if our current king was, you know, if their ancestor was God, and then somebody takes their throne, how are they related to God, right? And so in this case, a relation was done by declaring that people who follow the mandate of heaven are the ones who are true rulers in the name of heaven. And this religious change, by the way, as I said, I'm not going to go through any details of that history because it is very rich and very complex. But there were many periods where there were extensive periods of peace, and there were also extensive periods of war. And so in those periods of war, you know, leaders would be seen as failing because they could not prevent those wars from happening. And so we saw some of those changes reflected in religious.
Yeah, but it's still going on.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and many of the current changes or recent changes seem to be going back to some of those ideas of, you know, divine origin of those leaders. Well, this is the Temple of Tian in Beijing, in China, which was reconstructed in the 20th century. It is something that tourists go to see today, but that was a temple where the emperors of China. This one was built in 16th, 17th century originally on the place where older temples were, and it was a place where the emperor would basically worship, kind of ensured that everything the emperor was doing was supposed to be done based on the mandate of heaven. And the Chinese emperors were considered to be descendants of Tian, of heaven. This is same temple, the entrance. That's where the emperors the emperor would be carried over that ramp. This is a symbol that you've all seen so this is Taijitu, or yin-yang symbol. You all seen it before. By the way, I don't know if you remember on my first slide, there was a really old version of it. Did you see? That one was slightly different. Maybe I'll scroll real quick to remind you. You see, this one is really old. So they used to be drawn slightly differently. You know, the one I have later on is more modern, but they basically represent the same thing. So this one is more modern. So these are those two principles, yin and yang. And there are probably no other symbols that would capture Chinese religious traditions better than this one. And it is interesting, this one, for example, it is also surrounded by those trigrams, as people call them, I guess, signs made up of 3 lines, you see? And they actually stand in for, and there's a method, one of the classics of Chinese literature is Yi Jing. And Yi Jing is a book where there are basically 64 chapters, and each chapter is basically the answer to a query that you can ask from a person, or you can do it yourself. This is actually quite popular system of divination in the West too. So there are English translations. You can try that too. It's it's not like your 8-ball that that is, but it is very sophisticated. It is very interesting because the answers are so complex. They're written in very kind of multi-layered poetry. But I'm saying 64, and of course they're based on those signs here. So you see 3 full lines? That is yang. The idea is that, it represents hardness. It represents, mountains and so on. And this is yin here, you see? 3 open lines, right? And these are also cardinal directions. This is what would be consulted. Taoist experts who would, if you ask them where to build your house, how to put stuff in your house, where to put your bed and so on, they would look at the compass and they would figure out where the sides, cardinal directions are, and they would determine where is the right place to put something. And they are all related to this. So basically, the differentiation between those two and 4 cardinal directions give rise to those 8 trigrams here. And each of those trigrams can be on top or on the bottom. And if you have a combination, maximum number of combinations with 8 elements, and you combine 2 of them in any order, is 64. And that book has 64 chapters, and each chapter answers the question where your answer to that question was something like, there are 3 full lines on top, 3 full lines on bottom, or 3 full lines, any combination of those 4. And it is fascinating. You should look it up if you've never seen that. It is traditionally done, counting for what the answer is done with yarrow sticks, that plant, yarrow. And then you get the answer. Sometimes people do it with coins, tossing coins, and you get the answer. So it is another method of divination. That one is very old, and it is one of the classics of Chinese literature. So I'm bringing this up because, of course, whole point of I Ching, whole point of this system of divination is that we must align our lives. Basically, whenever we make a decision, we must do it by looking into the order of the universe. And those ways of doing divination help us with this. I'm sure some of you remember, in our country, in our civilization, those things still exist. I mean, you know that even today, the New York Times still has horoscope in it, right? So it's not unheard of, right? If the New York Times still has horoscope in it, people look. Actually, I know a person who is writing horoscope for Bloomberg. And I always am worried about those things. I'm thinking, do people still make financial decisions? People who read Bloomberg, they make decisions. So it exists today, even in the Western. And I'm sure some of you would remember. You remember back in 1980s when President and Mrs. Reagan were. So the news came out that they consulted an astrologer. Right? So just like people here were kind of maybe, I don't know, you can tell me what did you think, but many people were kind of worried, like, is the president really making decisions based on, even though, I guess the idea was that they asked something personal, it wasn't about kind of national, matters, it was about personal matters that they asked. We have very ambiguous at best view of those things, we might find them entertaining, but very few. In many cases in Chinese civilization, and especially with emperors, and especially with those early emperors, doing something without asking the oracle would be it would be unconscionable. It would be considered absolutely wrong. Why? Because your actions must be aligned with the universe. Does that make sense? So that was a religious tradition there. So there is this unseen order. We don't know exactly what it wants, but before we do something, we must consult it. Yes, yeah, definitely. Well, here is Confucius in one form. Confucius is, of course, someone who is considered to have been a historical figure. Many of those historical figures, there's no one really who doubts that someone like that existed, but there is also no real evidence. This is not because it's not about being too skeptical or something like that. There are many historical figures that nobody doubts that they existed, but actually the evidence is not as hard as you would think. Historians always have this issue. If you want to have some sort of first-hand evidence of someone even like Julius Caesar, that's not as simple. All we have is some writings that were written centuries later. So this is very interesting. Most of us do not think like that all the time. Historians do. So same thing about Confucius. Very few people doubt that there was historical Confucius, but when you really want to pin it down and figure out what do we know about him from his time, the answer is actually zero. Because first writings about him were written a few hundred years later. This is interesting because, and I'm drawing those, I began with some of those comparisons, but in Christianity, people ask about some of those things, is there any writing from Jesus' time about Jesus? No, all these writings come from much later. But whatever, this is not necessarily important for religious ideas at all, but it is interesting historically that actually this is true of almost anyone. If we would have something written about Jesus from Jesus' time, we would be very skeptical. Why? Because Jesus came from, because of his background, because of who he was. We don't have writings about any people who came from that background, someone of his social status and so on. We don't know anyone. So if we would know more about him, we would be more suspicious. Does that make sense? So actually, Confucius himself during his lifetime was not well known. He held only one office later on in life, and he was a local official for maybe just 1 or 2 years. So his career was not a success. When he died, he thought he will be forgotten. But he spent most of his life learning things and then also educating other people, and it was his disciples who later on made him into what we know about him today. So here are some central, you see this Tian again, so heaven kind of order of how the world is supposed to be very central for him. Interestingly enough, Confucius, and by the way, this name was given to him by Western scholars, basically, actually Catholic missionaries who went to China. They are the ones, Jesuit missionaries, coined that name. So Kung Tzu was what he was known as, Kung Fu Tzu, Kung Tzu? Confucius, yeah, Kung Fu Tzu or Kung Tzu. He himself in his writings, and I actually have one popular edition of his most famous. In English, they're called Analects. So in the Analects, which we don't know if he wrote this, like I said, his disciples, we know for sure, put them together later on. Analects are not written. Remember when I told you some parts of Bhagavad Gita, for example? You remember Bhagavad Gita when Krishna drives chariot and Arjuna? That whole story is one complete narrative. It is written as a narrative. It has beginning, middle, and the end, and so on. There is no such thing in the Analects. They are aphorisms. They are not even arranged in any particular way. And they do not represent one. Definitely there is no narrative, but they do not even seem to represent any one unified teaching. They are just list of complex statements about how does a person who follows Tian, who does the right thing, what do they do? So most of it is written as examples of what a good person does. And by the way, Confucius comes across actually many of those sayings. If you begin reading, you will think you are reading most humble person you ever met. Confucius was not bold. He said things like, everyone knows every fault I have, because he declared those in advance. And he said that he's happiest if he shows up somewhere and nobody recognizes him. So, very humble person, very humble person. And he thought that those are the qualities, and he did not put himself in that, so he did not claim greatness for himself, definitely. He was a very humble person. But he thought that people who could embody even more of being humble, even more goodness, even more of doing the right thing, are the ones who are then really following the primacy of Tian. His teachings were moral. They are focused, and that's what I said in the beginning with the axial age. So this is big shift. Suddenly, everything we find before Confucius was about this kind of transaction. We give gifts to our gods, basically, and they ought to give what we need in return. And that was it. And really, there was no question about, if I give appropriate gifts to the god, I'm supposed to get what I asked for. It has nothing to do with what kind of person I am. And here is a revolution of Confucius, if you want. He said, no, people who are in line with heaven are not the ones who give most gifts. They're the ones who live a certain life. And then, of course, there are specific things you have to do, and I'll go through some of those in a moment. Confucius himself, though, I just said that this is almost like a revolution in thinking, and that's how most scholars see it. However, Confucius was 100% clear that he did not invent anything new. This is also interesting. So he was one of those people who would always only say that ancient people did things right. He complained about his own time because he thought that people forgot how to do things right. But he did not say, you must do things as I say because I figured it out. Let me tell you how to do things. No, this would be the opposite. He was saying ancient people knew how to do things, and we should just go back and do as they did. And people today who say that they're doing this, they're not really doing this. They're failing because they don't, and then these are those things he insisted on, benevolence, basically, human-heartedness. So every action must be benevolent. Lee, etiquette. Your pastor asked about religious rituals. Confucius absolutely loved religious rituals. Everything for him. And so when here it says etiquette, this is everything for him. There are parts of Confucian writings that speaks specifically about how to dress. How does a scholar dress? What colors to wear, what colors not to wear, and so on. He discussed all those things. And what is the right way of greeting people, of doing anything in public? Everything was ritualized for him, everything, and this kind of proper etiquette is not what makes one great, but he said there is no great person who does not also have great etiquette and does not treat people with benevolence. And those people, they are, and this is his ideal, what he said everyone ought to strive to, Junzi. The ideal person. Later on, this was sometimes translated as scholar, of Confucian scholar, but basically person who does have benevolence in all of their actions and who knows what proper etiquette is for every action in their life. That person is and what is interesting, you remember with Buddha, I mentioned that I think only in passing, but this kind of, and somebody else, somebody asked me about this, and it was very much on point, exactly what Buddhism was like. Buddhism was also a critique of what was going on there before, because there are Buddha saying where he says, monks are not those who wear saffron-colored robes. You cannot put a robe on, shave your head, and be a monk. Monks act in a certain way. That's what makes Buddha also one of those leaders of what I said Karl Jaspers called the axial age, that kind of moral teaching at the core. And he criticized Vedic religion in India, Buddha did, for being prescriptive about rituals, but this had complete disregard for morality. He thought you ought to live a good life, act properly, and you remember I gave you those 8 things that you have to do right. That's what Junzi does in Confucianism too, very similar in that way. Confucius was big on tradition. So Confucianism is as conservative as you can imagine. You can tell also by him insisting that he's not bringing up any new teaching. He only talked about how things were done in the past. He's also venerated, well, like I said, he was a person, hard to reconstruct history, but he is someone who became divine figure. So definitely he's venerated in many Chinese temples. He's considered to be divine figure too. Here is one statue of Confucius. I had this one already. This is considered to be his tombstone, even though it was placed there much later. I see that time is again flying on me. I'm not going to go through everything here, but here are some central things. I already said about developed Junzi, ideal person in Confucianism. And then pursue personal virtue. And you do that in Confucianism, we all have all kinds of duties. And we have duties to people who are above us and duties to people we ought to take care of. And those are different. But this is central for Confucianism. So you have to serve your government, you have to teach the youth, and you have to transmit the ancient culture to posterity. And we all have a debt that we have to repay with those actions. So this is not something you're doing for your future. This is something that you already owe, because you wouldn't be here without people who did all those things before your time. So you're kind of, we all ought to repay our debt wherever it is due. By the way, I did use that term China. The name China comes from the Qin dynasty, which came later. So people back then would not necessarily think of themselves living in China. At that time, it still didn't have name. But Confucius definitely was central. His way of restating what he perceived to be Chinese tradition is the way in which, and especially later on emperors, at one point his teachings were declared to be the official teachings of Chinese empire, and Confucian scholars, actually a requirement to become government servant was to pass the exam that would certify that you are Confucian scholar. So very, very influential. Here are those four values that one has to espouse. Ren, kindness and benevolence. Li, courtesy, propriety. Zhao, filial piety. Very, very important. Towards your parents, reverence for one's parents, duty towards one's children, duty towards one's siblings, and everything is hierarchical. Who is older, who is younger. And we all have duties that are different duties, but we all have duties towards all of those. And by the way, that is where, for Confucius, everything begins. He taught that if families are not virtuous, then villages are not going to be virtuous. If villages are not virtuous, then, larger political units are not going, and then the state is not going to function. So if you want to fix the state, if you don't like our politics, for someone like Confucius, work on your virtues. Make sure your family works well, then help other families, and so on. It's very interesting. So it builds bottom up, not top down. Of course, in an empire, the emperor's duty is to serve all of their people, and the people have the duty to serve the emperor. However, if the emperor is not serving people, then the people do not have the obligation to serve the emperor. So all those things are in balance. You remember yin and yang? They have to be in balance. Same is true of all interpersonal relations. Here's a quote from the Analects in regard to the aged, so your duties, what we all must do. In regard to the aged, to give them rest. In regard to friends, to show them sincerity. In regard to the youth, to treat them tenderly. That's how Junzi acts, right? The scholar, the virtuous person. Everything. And so this means you cannot treat everyone the same, because your role is different depending on to whom do you relate. Here are examples of 5 basic relationships according to Confucius. This is related to that ideal of filial piety, respect for your parents in the first place, but and by the way, in traditional Chinese culture, and especially in Confucianism, everything begins with one's family. So the idea that you love your family more than everyone else is absolutely a given. So when we do good things to people to whom we are not related, we do those things also because we know that they have their family. So out of respect for our own family, we help other families and so on. But everything begins with one's family. So being partial to your own kin in Confucianism, there's nothing wrong with it. It actually is a place where everything begins. And then you move on from there, and then everything ends up in harmony. So it's very interesting in that way. So you cannot, I didn't go through this. So these are examples. So father must relate to, I didn't put those names. These are straight from the analects, so they're gendered in this way. I guess parents have to be kind to their children, and children must express their piety for their parents. Older brother has to be gentle to younger brother or younger sibling, and younger sibling must respect elder sibling. Husbands might be righteous to their wives, and wives must be obedient. Again, this is, Confucianism is also very patriarchal. I'm not talking about my ideas or ideas that I would consider appropriate today. We are talking about the ancient world here. But this is the idea. So you see, balance, yin, yang. And if one side doesn't work, you cannot blame the other side. Both need to be in balance. There's no balance if one side wants to take over. So both sides break down at the same time. That's what I'm saying. So if there is no kindness, then there is no piety. If there is no piety, there is no kindness, and so on. And then elders must humanely treat their juniors, and juniors must defer. They must display deference towards their elders. Rulers must display benevolence, and subjects must display loyalty. Again, same thing. It goes from one's closest family, one's parents, all the way to the emperor, basically. The idea is that the emperor is basically like father of all people, but the emperor cannot act against the good for all people, basically. If emperors do not act out of their benevolence, then people do not have to be loyal. But in those cases, everything breaks down. And Confucius warned about those things because before his time, there were numerous wars that took place that he read about in history. The experience of those things was palpable. By the way, the age, Chinese name for the age that he lived in English translation, would be autumn and spring and autumn period. It's a very nice name for historical period. So lowest type of filial piety is to support one's parents, and then higher than that is not to bring humiliation to one's parents and ancestors, and the highest is to glorify them. These are Confucius. I'm not good with time. I think I said this last time. Every lecture I always give is usually 90 minutes. My lectures are all time to 90 minutes. This is just how my schedule works. So let's switch real quick to Taoism. So Taoism is another great tradition from China, and Taoism can be understood as a way of critiquing the rigidity of Confucianism. If you like someone who has planned for everything, who figured everything out, who knows what to do, what is proper thing to do in every moment, Confucius is your person. He really figured out. But sometimes that can be so constricting and so unlike how life is that tradition developed in China. That tradition also has its roots. Just like Confucianism comes from deep, deep, deep antiquity, but it was reframed in moral terms in his time. So does Taoism. By the way, I'm not an expert in pronouncing Chinese words. Tao is typically spelled with a T. Yeah, I spelled it here with a D. In English, typically it is spelled with a T, but it is pronounced like a D. Does that make sense? So it is spelled T-A-O, but it is pronounced Tao. So these figures here Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi, they are considered to be kind of, actually we don't know if those were historical persons, especially for Lao Tzu. But they are the founders. Two main, Lao Tzu is considered to be the founder, and Zhuangzi is considered to be next kind of classic of Taoist thinking. Lao Tzu wrote a book, and I have, this book is, I think I read that somewhere, so I'm just repeating what I heard. I didn't count all of those. It is second most, it's originally in Chinese, this is English translation, second most translated book into English after the Bible. Interesting. Tao Te Ching, classic about the way, the power and the way. Tao is sometimes translated as the way.
When was it first published?
Well, traditionally, you mean,
When was it first written?
So-
In that time?
yes,
Okay.
yes, maybe about 5th century BC. The oldest manuscript that we have of both of those is from 2nd century BCE. There are actual manuscripts from that time, so they must be much older than that. But they are probably, so they're definitely older than Christian scriptures. But we actually have manuscripts, like the Old Testament, for example, oldest manuscripts are not as old as those writings are. The oldest manuscripts of the Old Testament are not that old. They're not as old as oldest manuscripts of the New Testament, for example. But here, these predate both of those oldest manuscripts that would be sources for Judaism and Christianity, for example. So, central, and by the way, that book is so famous. I have few things I have bookmarks in few places just for tonight. It's so interesting because this book just will either open your eyes or drive you crazy. It is written in very poetic language that is very difficult to to be clear on what it means. But it begins by saying the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. Typically, that word is not translated into English. Like I said, it means the way, so kind of the way things are. But it is not translated. So it says that if you can talk about it, and that, by the way, is a famous quote that you hear quite often, if you can talk about it, those who know, they do not talk, and those who talk, they do not know. This is, the quote. It says here that the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. The unnameable is the eternally real. Naming is the origin of all particular things. Free from desire, you realize the mystery. Caught in desire, you see only the manifestations. Yet mystery and manifestations arise from the same source. This source is called darkness. Darkness within darkness, a gateway to all understanding. And that's how the whole book, by the way, it's also very, very short, easy to read, even though it looks bigger here. All chapters are about 1 page long. So there are 81 chapters, and each chapter is 1 page long. So it's very easy. So if you don't have anything, you'll be delighted. Or you might actually throw it away because it will drive you crazy. But the point is that it does invite you to think about what that way really means. And that's, I think, its main purpose. You cannot read this book without beginning to think, what is it talking about? And this book, just like the Analects, basically talks about the ideal person. This person in the book is called a master. There's a figure called a master, and everything in the book, it says, a master does things this way. And basically, usually it's something unexpected. And here is one, this Wu Wei, action without intention. Sometimes translated action without action. Just like in Confucianism, there is always the right thing to do. The ideal of Taoism is don't do too much. Back off. The main metaphor used in this book is water. And it basically says water can dissolve mountains. Just give it time. And water is unstoppable. You can build a dam, and if you wait, water will go over it. There is no way of stopping water. And it says the way is like water. And interestingly enough, it says, unexpected things. Water seeks low places, dirty places. It's really interesting. Imagery of this book is surprising. It really makes you think about things. What is the way? What is the right way of doing things? But it definitely warns about being prescriptive about life. So the ideal is, imagine, if you put, a leaf on a river and it just flows. That's what's going on with life, according to Lao Tzu, according to Tao Te Ching. If you want to go up against the stream, you can for a little while. You can throw a leaf in a river and then push it. How long can you do that? As soon as you stop, it will go. So don't do that. Don't do. Do less. So it is very interesting. Of course, it also at times sounds very much antithetical to our modern society today. So if you ever need a reprieve from, our way of life today, read that book. And it will tell you everything is fine, back off, do nothing, wait, be spontaneous also, This is what the master is. When the master does something, everything turns out well, and at the end people say, we did it ourselves. Nobody knows that it was the master who done it. It's very interesting. So definitely, here is the image of Lao Tzu on a water buffalo, riding out of the city. He usually holds a scroll in the drawings like this, and the scroll, he supposedly was so disenchanted with the way Confucians run the society at that time. It was too rigid for him. He wrote this book, gave it to his disciples, and left. And basically, Taoism is way more. Like I said, it existed long before Lao Tzu was written. And it definitely has many forms. Sometimes Western scholars call this form philosophical Taoism, even though I guess there is no real distinction between philosophical Taoism and other forms of Taoism. But the idea is that perfect life, and in that way it became so popular, especially back in 1960s in this country, because it definitely, explicitly calls us to live in harmony with nature. And the idea is also, and that's how Lao Tzu is also considered to be immortal, basically. If you live in harmony with nature, you live forever, basically. Kind of, in Taoist thinking, really sometimes physically, so there are people who are immortal because they know how to live in perfect harmony with nature. They just don't get sick. So here's the image of Lao Tzu. This is hard to see, but Chinese art and some of the most famous examples of Chinese art, they are all inspired by this book, this kind of weathered down landscape where everything is in balance, in harmony, but also weathered down, kind of just stays there, and life happens. This way of thinking is the product of Lao Tzu. I'm again going over time, so I'll just mention a few more things. By the way, I'm sure you heard of, for example, alchemy. This was something that was also popular in the Western world. The idea that you can transform, I guess more explicitly, base metals into gold and so on. That actually did originate in China. So it was Taoist scholars who did that. So all of alchemy, original texts, the name came from Arabic actually, because Arabic scholars through Central Asia came in contact with some of those writings, Taoist writings about alchemy, because the mineral cinnabar was also what they discussed. And cinnabar was something that alchemists used too. I don't know if you know how cinnabar looks like. It's red, right? It's mercury sulfite or something like that. It's a chemical compound of mercury and sulfur. And that when you see it, it looks like blood. And somehow that captured people's imagination for some reason. Of course, if you heat cinnabar without oxygen, if you heat it in a closed vessel, at one point, suddenly, reaction happens. This is just chemistry. I'm not a chemist, so look it up here. What happens is, suddenly, they separate, and you have sulfur and mercury separate. And that really puzzled people. Look, this reddish earth, basically, like red earth. It looks, it's very red. It's like blood. And they thought that human blood, I'm oversimplifying this, is somehow also the way what life is, the mystery of life is somehow contained in that mineral. And so that's where alchemy kind of balancing those things out. So some of those classics of Taoist alchemy ended up being read by Arabic scholars who ended up then bringing it to Europe, and that's where alchemy, all those people come from. It's very interesting. But alchemy there was connected with immortality, basically with gaining perfect health and immortality. And it was because of that kind of special, interesting property of cinnabar and how they figured out. So Taoism also has, this is sometimes called church Taoism, or Taoist church, basically. There are priests, there are priests with, as you can see, this priest has numerous acolytes. So there are rituals, they're transmitted usually in a family, from generation to generation, and basically for various occasions when you need help with something, especially for things like funerals, when you have to properly honor your ancestors and so on, you would then pay those priests. They come in and they do services. They can go into special states of mind. They understand where is your ancestor, how to help them. Typically, they can exchange whatever gifts you give them to kinds of things that can be brought into the supernatural world, and they basically help usher your ancestors where they have to be and bring peace and harmony to the village and so on. Those are very complex rituals. They're performed for the gods, they're performed for the people around. They're fascinating to see, very complicated. This is, of course, done every spring. People go to visit there. This is done, here is just one person, but typically whole family goes to clean and to bring gifts to the ancestors' graves. So the idea of ancestor worship, I didn't mention that, was big part of Chinese traditions from the beginning. So we have those things on those bones. I kind of mentioned it. Sometimes there are you have dreams of someone from your family who passed away, and you wonder, what are they trying to tell me? Why is this happening? You go to those priests, they can tell you what's happening, and then you do certain rituals, you properly, Right, in this case it is food. And also, cleaning food, but also firecrackers and all kinds of things to warn off evil spirits, you can chase them away. And here is, well, I'll skip through most of those things. Well, sometimes people this was very influential military general who became a god, basically, who is venerated. I'm sure if nowhere else in some restaurants here, I've seen this image in so many. Here is another divinity. Well, this mother goddess can reward its devotees with eternal life. This is a place where supposedly Confucius taught. Confucianism is also a very big religious tradition in Korea. So this is from South Korea. So large parts of East Asia, not just China, were influenced by. Here's a monastery, the hanging monastery, with both. And this is true in almost all Chinese temples. If you go, especially to those local temples, they all have altars to Confucius and also to Lao Tzu. It's interesting. And in most cases to Buddha too. In this monastery, Buddhists, Taoists, and Confucianists are all together. And there's altars to all those figures. Here is an interesting thing that you can see many of those. Supposedly this building was built with this opening here because of Taoist principles of how to construct a building to let the energy go through, because the building was built in a place in which it was occluding the passage of the wind and so on, so it must be open to keep it in harmony with the nature.
Are you talking about feng shui?
Yes, that is what comes from Taoism. Here, and I will end with this. This is my last slide. Here, I don't know if you can see this, but you see one person in the middle has saffron-colored robe. It's kind of washed-out color here. That's the Buddha, actually. And here, I don't know if you can see, this person holds a scroll. That's Lao Tzu. And this is Kung Tzu. So Confucius, Buddha, and Lao Tzu together, you see. This is quite common. None of those pictures come from their time, you know, those illustrations were done later on. But it is interesting because they are seen in China as mutually completing each other. So if you ask anyone, are you a Taoist or a Confucianist or Buddhist, they will be confused. You know, those three things are definitely not mutually exclusive. And in most cases, local temples can be to another god, some of those other gods I've shown, or local earth god or something like that. So you go into a temple, there's main god there, but there is also Confucius, there is also Buddha, there is also Lao Tzu in people pay respect. In many of those temples you can do, there are other ways of doing divination, typically with those oracle blocks that are thrown there, and then you can get the answer. Those typically give you like yes or no answer. It is like that 8-ball type. But those answers are very much personal, kind of, you know, nobody knows what did you ask about, but they are considered to be very important because, again, like I said, that's how one aligns oneself with the order of the world. There is no way of doing justice to any tradition, really, but when we talk about China especially, as you know, I'm sure, you know, what is it? I don't even know what the percent, almost 20% of world's population is Chinese. So we're talking about huge chunk, like 18% of people in the world are Indian. So we talked about some of those traditions that make up so much of humanity in the world, and both of those civilizations have deep roots that go as far back as we can tell. So what I'm trying to do here is just entice your, you know, interest and imagination. I hope you will continue thinking about those things. So thank you.
For the Chinese, we add 3 years to their life on the headstone.
Oh,
Because, you know, it's for the past, the thing, and then the present and the future. You add 3 years to their life when they're gone.
mm,
Because the future is like they're going to live forever, and the present then, the present is when they die. And the past, you know, whatever went on in their life, they're going to see how it goes.
very interesting. Thank you.
And then we do a usual thing. I don't really like it. We put food on the headstone when we
Yeah,
go to
yeah.
the cemetery,
Yes.
and then we have candlelit. I brought one of my friends over, they said, what is this, a picnic? This is not a picnic. But that's how we do it, and we do our ritual thing and everything.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Oh, yeah. Well, that's another tradition from India that I did not talk about, but Jainism is, so Mahavira was the founder of Jainism. Mahavira, kind of similar to Confucius, he said that he's not the first one who invented that teaching. He said that there were 23 teachers before him. They are called Tirthankaras in India. And so Mahavira was probably a contemporary of Buddha. And Jainism is, in terms of numbers, not as big as those other traditions, and that's one reason why I skipped it, but exceptionally influential, both historically and even today. If you never heard any, well, I don't know how many of you heard about, obviously you did, Jainism. So Jain or Jain, it comes from the title that Mahavira got, the person who is the founder of Jainism, of someone who conquered, that's what that name means, who conquered reality, this world. He overcame issues that any human being would have, and he kind of attained higher knowledge. In Jain universe, Kevala, there are levels of reality, and he managed to understand them all. And he did it through asceticism, renunciation. You remember when I talked about the Buddha, when I talked about Siddhartha Gautama, how he practiced asceticism and then gave up on it and actually produced a systematic critique of asceticism. You remember the idea, if you do not do well to yourself, you're not going to be around to do any spiritual things. That's Buddhism. Mahavira was almost the other way around. You do have to overcome that. And so Mahavira would, fast forever and so on, and that's what Jains still do today. That's kind of ideal way of even passing away is to stop eating. But what I was about to say, what Mahavira insisted on the most, absolutely central thing for Jainism is nonviolence. That's right. Not even, you're exactly right. Not even ants. So Jain monks, and they have two different kinds of monks. They have those Digambara monks and they have Shvetambara monks. And so those monks, they often they carry a whisk and they use it to remove. And it's supposed to be not just for visible things like small insects or something. It was supposed to be for invisible things. There are, according to Jain teachings, there are invisible living things. The whole world is divided in their metaphysics into jiva and ajiva. Ajiva means non-living and jiva means living. And so harming any living being. And somebody asked about karma. So karma is big part of Jainism too. But in Jainism, that understanding of karma is even more narrow. Basically, like I said, karma means action. In Jainism, almost any action produces negative results. You know, if I move around, I'm stepping on living beings that I don't know. So, and of course, on one hand, we can think, oh, those people, this sounds like, you know, obsessive compulsive, you know, like, who can live like that? Those monks, by the way, they cannot, when they sleep, they have to sleep on the ground, but when they, at night, they're not allowed to turn at night without waking up, whisking, and then turning. Like, this is serious, serious stuff. But the idea is that that care for invisible things is an outward sign of the idea that we can do bad things without knowing, without understanding. So going through life thinking that, you know, I can say something that I think is so nice to say, but I cannot know how does everyone understand that, right? So in Jainism, I ought to be very concerned about that. So every action I do, I have to keep in mind that there are unintended consequences of it. So it's very severe type of asceticism. And most important thing in it, and that's the point that made it so famous in 20th century, because if no one else, it was Mahatma Gandhi who popularized it. He was a Hindu, he wasn't Jain, but he lived in a place where many Jains live, and he had friends, and he learned from his friends about nonviolence. So you remember great Indian civic leader, fighter for Indian independence. In India, everyone was afraid what will happen if India tries to overthrow British colonial rule. And he decided to do it without violence. And that seemed preposterous. How can you do that? Nonviolence?
How do they know if they're do good or bad, though?
Well, you know, that's what he learned from Jains. So basically, the idea is nonviolence does not mean passivity, does not mean do nothing. You know, there are ways of being nonviolent. And so it is interesting. So he credited his Jain friends for teaching him that. And as you know, in this country, of course, it is interesting how those things work. Because Gandhi at one point, you know that Gandhi was educated in England. He was a lawyer, basically, a barrister. He was from very high-class family. You know, he studied in England, best universities and everything. And when he came to England, being a Hindu, he said, now I have to read something about Christianity because I'm going to Christian land. You know, I better know something about Christianity. So he read the New Testament, and he said he was never in his life more confused about things. He said, this book and what I thought Christians are and what I thought Christianity is, and Jesus, how did those two things go together? He couldn't figure it out. Gandhi thought Jesus, I totally understand Jesus. I just don't understand Christians. So I'm bringing this up because, as you know, in this country, Martin Luther King Jr. was inspired by Gandhi. And as you know, King, he did his PhD in theology at Boston University. He studied, you know, people say Dr. Martin. He was doctor of theology, you know, Christian theology. So it's interesting that you have a Hindu person going to England and then learning about Christianity and then learning from another religion, Jainism, and making that into his Because for him, for Gandhi, Jesus was kind of like those Jain, in many ways. I'm not trying to conflate all this because you don't want to blend everything into something, that makes no sense at the end. But for Gandhi, that made sense. And then you have this Christian theologian King here use those ideas for the civil rights movement. Again, same thing, because nonviolence was so important, because Mahavira was absolutely clear that with violence, you just beget more violence. That's straight from Jainism. You cannot solve things with violence. You think you can. And by the way, both Confucius and Lao Tzu would be on board with this. They both taught that solving things with violence is, I do have one quote that I can share since you asked that question. It's very interesting. When the Tao is lost, there is goodness, which is very interesting when you kind of begin to think like that. When goodness is lost, there is morality. When morality is lost, there is ritual. Ritual is the husk of true faith, the beginning of chaos. So when chaos, you see, Tao Te Ching says, if everything is as it's supposed to be, according to the Tao, you don't need goodness. You don't need morality. You don't need ritual. You don't need faith. Everything is fine. So we need morality when things are not the way. And it's very interesting, through this kind of descent from how things are when everything is in its right, when everything is as it is supposed to be, it's very different. So unusual way of thinking, but that's the understanding there. It's same, by the way, and this statement probably has deep political connotations too, because it means that government is not running things well if it must use coercion or something like that. Yes, sir.
Could you just read that over again?
Yes. Which one did I read? So this is chapter 38 of Tao Te Ching. I just read one part. Actually, first part has more. The part I read is when the Tao is lost, there is goodness. When goodness is lost, there is morality. When morality is lost, there is ritual. Ritual is the husk of true faith, the beginning of chaos. It begins, the chapter begins, and that's why I'm bringing this. The chapter begins when it says, the master doesn't try to be powerful, thus he is truly powerful. The ordinary man keeps reaching for power, thus he never has enough. So that with power, with violence, with things like that. And then unusual things. The master does nothing, yet leaves nothing undone. The ordinary man is always doing things, yet many more are left to be done. So yeah, it's very interesting. I love this book, but it always leaves me puzzled. You feel like you're reading something profound, or maybe just, maybe it's just makes no sense. Yes.
You mentioned morality there, but I thought you said earlier there wasn't any during that period of time. And also, how would that relate to the Ten Commandments? Time-wise.
Yeah, you're right. What I said earlier is that before Confucius and before Lao Tzu, who comes after Confucius, there was no talk about morality. They brought it in. So yes, it is here, definitely. Except it is very different than the kind of Confucian morality, which is very active. So if you like this yin-yang metaphor here, this is yin. This is feminine. This is water. Confucius is yang. It's masculine, it's day, it's power, right? So and then balance between them would be, I guess, what is ideal for both of them. So this is supposed to be kind of counterbalance to power, counterbalance to let's do everything. Here it says, let's stay back and do nothing. In that way, it is challenging our modern way of, if you, I don't think there are any successful CEOs in US who read this book. I mean, maybe they did read it.